G'day everyone and welcome to VLGA Connect. It's the weekly governance update, and if you think it's not coming at you on the usual day, you're absolutely right. We're doing this on a Sunday, Stephen Cooper, hence the casual attire. Hello to you.
Hello, Chris. It seems like just something out of a very dusty version of a Johnny Cash song at the moment.
A Sunday morning coming down.
I knew
Now,
you'd get that reference.
absolutely. Now, the reason we're doing this on a Sunday is because we ran out of time to record it on Friday at the wonderful Fast Track Day.
We did. We had all the best intentions of doing a lunchtime recording, and we just got a bit overwhelmed by the time available. So this was the next best thing. But yeah, really enjoyed Fast Track, Chris.
Steve, I imagine you've been overwhelmed with texts and emails saying, where is it? Because they haven't come to me, so I'm assuming they're coming to you.
No.
Oh,
I think, and I would like to put that down to trust, which was the theme of Fast Track, Chris, that people have trust that it will happen.
Excellent point. Excellent point. And of course, we must mention our terrific sponsors, Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, who make it possible for us to bring you this 30 minutes or so of I was going to say nonsense, but we've actually got some serious stuff to talk about today, Steve, and quite a bit on the list. I know you've been keeping your ear to the ground, picking up some reaction to the announcement of the new allowances that have been announced for councillors, including mayors and deputy mayors in Victoria. The Remuneration Tribunal has made its first determination under LGA 2020.
Yeah, I had a very interesting conversation. I didn't ask this person if I should give them a name, but with a metropolitan mayor during the week. And I'm quite happy if they want to name themselves on social media. And there were two elements to the conversation, which one of which in particular, I know we both had sort of missed in the early glance. It was tucked away right at the back of the report, Chris, was that those new allowances, as announced, now include the superannuation component, which councils previously, if they wanted to pay superannuation, needed to unanimously resolve in addition to the allowance. So in a sense, that erodes any perceived increase in the allowances, Chris.
Yeah, good point. It did. I did miss that on first look. It looked like a more significant increase than it's turned out to be. That's assuming that all councils had chosen to pay the superannuation. Have you got a sense of whether that was happening across the board or just?
I don't think it's across the board, Chris, but my kind of informal observation would be that most councils had done that.
Yes.
It certainly wasn't uncommon.
So important to note that the new figures, which have been set for the next 4 or 5 years, I think out to 24, 25, do include the superannuation entitlements. The other key issue here is the introduction of an allowance for the deputy mayor, and there's been some discussion about what that really signifies.
That's right, and the conversation with the mayor that I had and was the suggestion that, well, it's a recognition that there is clearly some form of additional responsibility that goes with being the deputy mayor, but isn't it interesting that that's not legislated, and in fact that there is no automatic step up if the mayor is absent for the deputy mayor to fulfil that role. So we're in this sort of still a state of vagary, and councils having to be really clear about, well, what would be required, and would they appoint the deputy mayor as a mayor, even though as an acting mayor, even though it's quite clear that that's the inference.
Well, yes, I would argue that the Act, it does talk about the deputy mayor being the person who would step in if the mayor is incapable or unable of fulfilling for the role. But you're right, it doesn't quite go to the point of saying that that deputy would automatically be regarded as the acting mayor in those circumstances.
No, and I think my advice to were I required to give it to any council who were thinking of appointing someone other than the deputy mayor as the acting mayor would be that, well, you as a group will look a bit dysfunctional were you to do that.
Yeah, and I guess it could be subjective too, couldn't it? Depending on the circumstances as to whether it meets some sort of threshold that the deputy mayor steps in as the mayor. What if it's in the middle of some contention? There's probably some good reasons why the Act doesn't say that.
I would like to hope there's a good reason. You usually sort of think, well, if the Parliament wanted to do that, that's what they would have done. And normally government's in receipt of pretty extensive advice, and when you think through the consultation process. So yeah, perhaps you're right, Chris.
Yeah, I was just thinking that through on the spot. So just for clarity, at the moment it's the same as it always is. If a deputy mayor or any other councillor is going to be an acting mayor, it needs to be by resolution of the council.
Absolutely. And look, maybe, Chris, too, there's also a bit of vagary about a mayor being unable to perhaps attend an event versus a mayor being incapacitated or away and not able to perform official duties like, chairing council meetings and so on, and having that absolute clarity that the council did mean to appoint an acting mayor.
Yep. Spot on.
Yeah.
Now, before we get off that issue of allowances and superannuation, I just want to make the point for our interstate viewers and listeners that in New South Wales, for the first time, councillors there are going to be able to be paid superannuation payments with new legislative provisions kicking in on the 1st of July. It is optional, so a council has the discretion and needs to make a formal resolution if they intend on making superannuation payments on behalf of councillors. And I understand the New South Wales Office of Local Government has issued some guidance to councils around the introduction of those measures in this past week.
Isn't that interesting too, Chris? Because I would have presumed Victorian councils have been doing that for at least the last 12 or 15 years or so. And it's an interesting one because, as we've talked about before, it's a council allowance, not a salary. But there has been a long-held recognition that it's a reasonable thing for councillors to be able to make a contribution to their superannuation, because otherwise their retirement plans would be compromised by their term on the council, or could be compromised. And it's important that we remove as many economic barriers as possible to people standing or acting on council.
Absolutely. And on that issue of it being different in New South Wales to Victoria, Steve, it never fails to surprise me how many differences there are between the different states in terms of the local government environment. In doing the Local Government News Roundup podcast, I've learnt that on a number of fronts in the last 12 months. And I might just give a plug. I'm delivering some training on behalf of LG Pro on the Introduction to Local Government course this week for a Tasmanian audience, and I've had to brush up on the differences between the Victorian and Tasmanian local government environment, and there are some considerable and significant differences. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, you will be the go-to person on those nuances, Chris. Well done.
Thanks, Steve. All right, so there's lots of big news this week. I want to just very quickly mention that Julie Reid, the Executive Director of Local Government Victoria, has announced that she's stepping down from the position from the 1st of April for personal reasons. I had a chat with Julie at your Fast Track Day on Friday, Steve. She's looking forward to having a bit of a break and then some new and exciting opportunities, still expecting to be involved in the sector, which will be nice.
I would say so, Chris, and there's a lot of goodwill to Julie, I'm sure.
Another interesting development this week, Steve, the countback was held on Wednesday for the vacancy at Moreland City Council, and viewers and listeners will recall that this vacancy arose due to the resignation of Malad El Halabi, and it's all linked in with those allegations of voting fraud from the election back in 2020, which is still subject to a much bigger VCAT process. But long story short, the successful person, Sean Minahan, did not complete the declaration of eligibility within the 48 hours required. It's the first time I recall this happening in a while, Steve.
I mean, there may well have been examples where that has occurred, Chris, but I'm not aware of any. So presumably we go back and do another countback.
That is correct. So my understanding is Mr. Minahan obviously reviewed circumstances and decided not to proceed, which is perfectly valid. I do wonder whether that broader issue that's still in VCAT would perhaps influence someone in determining whether they wanted to significantly change their life to become a councillor with that in the background. But effectively, as you say, it's back for take two, and it's happening tomorrow, Monday the 21st of March at I think 10 a.m. or thereabouts. So we'll bring the result of that to you in the roundup and future editions of VLGA Connect.
Yeah, and it's a reasonable thing, Chris, for any prospective elected councillor to have the opportunity to make that sort of review and reconsider whether they wanted to take on the responsibility of councillor. So, that's a decision that people can make.
Other bit of trivia, there were 13 candidates left from the 2020 election. One of those ruled themselves out as being ineligible, which meant there were 12. So I'm assuming there's now 11.
11.
For the countback that's happening tomorrow. Let's hope only one more is required, Steve.
Good luck to Moreland on that one, Chris.
Now, serious story here, Steve, that brought back some memories for you of some more local issues. A tragic boarding house fire in New South Wales. This raises some questions around internal department communications for you.
Chris, absolutely tragic, the boarding house fire at Newtown, and that process will take its course through the courts by the sound of things if one goes with media releases. But I think it reminded me for council management and for audit and risk committees that there are a couple of really significant issues affecting Victorian councils going back over the years that are worthy of review, just to make sure that our systems and processes are in place. There was a similar tragic fire about 15 years ago affecting the Moreland, the boarding house premises in Brunswick that affected the Moreland again council. And the issue there, Chris, was that that premises had been subject to various inspections between both the health and the building surveyors. There were issues around obstructions and locks and free egress from premises, as I recall. And you might know that any public building, any boarding house needs to have a lock that isn't deadlocked from the inside, I suppose, Chris. And that was one of the problems. But I believe at the time it was found that the council ought to have known. So those circumstances are worthy of review, even when it's not the responsible department that's having a look, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And you also reminded me of a Pyrenees Shire Council case that goes back even further, back to 1997, this one.
Yeah, and it's worth a look too, Chris. It was one, and this is my layman's view of it, Chris, where the really significant element of the Pyrenees one was the council was found to have owed a duty of care to the neighbouring properties, not just the subject premises. And this was in Beaufort, I believe. And they were premises that ought reasonably have been known that if one went up, the whole block would go. The council's building department identified some problems with a fireplace, and in fact issued correspondence to the owners and occupiers of the property to say that the fireplace should not be used, but didn't actually go to that next step of ensuring that the fireplace was disabled, if you like. And then, of course, surprise, surprise, there was a fire, and the council had found to have some liability to the neighbouring properties as well. But it's more an issue, I think, around what the internal processes of the organisation are when it identifies that there is, in fact, a hazard. So, again, worthy of review, Chris.
Absolutely. I found this really, I hadn't read this before, really interesting. The High Court found that the council was liable of failing to exercise a discretionary power, even though there was no public expectation that the power would be exercised, and the person affected did not rely on the local authority to do so. Really interesting when you pull that apart, isn't it?
Well, it becomes a risk management issue, doesn't it, Chris? Well, this is in the sort of unlikely but catastrophic kind of, or highly serious quadrant of your risk management profile, because there's a lot of discretionary powers that any council would not exercise because of the fact that there's not seen to be a risk. And sometimes no action's taken and we get it wrong.
All right, a cautionary tale, as we often say. Now, speaking of the courts, someone reminded me during the week that we've had a few stories of what they characterised as potentially men behaving badly in local government land, Steve. There's one that caught my eye, your eye, I think even Tony Rounick's eye at Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, involving a Tasmanian councillor who's been in court and has pleaded not guilty to a charge of prohibited behaviour. Now, what's really interesting about the case itself is interesting. This councillor from Waratah Wynyard is alleged to have exposed himself 3 times to a woman and her son. The woman is a prosecutor. because the defendant here is a councillor, they've taken the steps of bringing in a magistrate or a judge, I'm not sure what's the right term here, magistrate, I think, from interstate to deal with this issue, Steve.
Well, there's more to the story, Chris, because the woman's husband was also a witness and he is a magistrate. And hence, I think because of his involvement in the case, it was the view, presumably from the law or the Justice Department in Tasmania, was that there would be a conflict of interest because he's a colleague for any Tasmanian magistrate to hear the matter. So a South Australian magistrate was brought in. Nice way of dealing with the conflict of interest, I would have thought. And I know from time to time councils have, particularly rural councils, have authorised, for example, local law staff from a neighbouring municipality to assist in resolving issues where it's been apparent that the council's own staff, through lack of numbers, would be conflicted in a particular matter. So nice reminder that where there are conflicts of interest, there are a range of remedies available.
Yes, we often have reason to talk about how you might deal with conflicts, whether they're perceived or otherwise. I think for the sake of completeness, if people want to know more about this, they can see the link in the show notes to an ABC report. But I do want to point out that the councillor, Councillor Darren Fairbrother, has denied the allegation. He told the court that it was not possible that he'd done what he's accused of because he was wearing a G-string underneath string-drawn shorts that fell down when they became snagged on a rock.
Chris, I will leave the details of the case to others. I think you've described that well. The only other comment I would make to bring that back to local government land is that, actually two things. One is I understand that the court is yet to hand down a verdict or a decision on this matter. And the second thing is that the councillor or the councillor's representative has called into question the reliability of the two witnesses, one of whom is a Crown prosecutor, the other of whom is a magistrate. And it will be interesting when the court comes down between the councillor, a Crown prosecutor and a magistrate as to who is more reliable.
Yes, perhaps enough said.
I think so.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Chris.
We're going to stay in Tassie, though. We talk about culture a lot on this program as well. And one council in Tasmania, in the Hobart area, this is Clarence City Council, has undertaken, I think at the instigation of the mayor, a review of its culture. And what's come back has been pretty damning about the situation inside that council organisation, Steve.
And Chris, you've put the link on the show notes, I believe. Engaged a law firm to undertake a cultural review, and some but not all councillors participated. But the review was not especially complimentary, Chris.
No, it's found an unsatisfactory culture exists with occasional instances of inappropriate behaviour by elected members towards members of staff, according to this independent report. A couple of things that jumped out at me. It appears that there's broad consensus that the culture is in need of improvement. No such consensus on the cause of that unsatisfactory culture, Steve.
Well, and we talked about that a bit at Fast Track, Chris, with our various panellists, that often with culture, it's not just one thing. There's no silver bullet, but culture's like water. When it's not right. Chris, there was an interesting quote contained in the ABC report of this issue from Councillor Tony Mulder, or Alderman Mulder, who said the review unfairly focused on the relationship when there were more than two aldermen whose behaviour was detailed in the reports. I think Tony Mulder was saying that it's not just two councils, it's the whole council. And he says he's taken the report as a mirror, but it seems some of the aldermen see it as a window to other people's behaviour instead. Now, I don't know, Chris, I think we can't dive into the details of what's going on with the individuals that are involved, but I really love that notion of everyone receiving a report like that and treating it as a mirror. It seemed like a nice metaphor.
I think that's brilliant. In fact, since you first pointed it out to me, I've used it a couple of times, treating it as a mirror and not just as a window.
Yeah, one more on that. It's interesting, though. He also said the yelling and the shouting, it's in the eye of the subject as to whether it's bullying or not. My take on that would be there shouldn't be yelling and shouting. whether you want to call it bullying or anything, I think if you've got yelling and shouting, you've got a cultural issue.
Absolutely right, and you've lost the argument, I would think, if you've gotten to the point of yelling and shouting. All right, so yes, there is a link to that in the show notes if people would like to read more about what's going on at Clarence Valley. And another quick Tasmanian note, Steve, we know that Hobart's been looking into the issue of Airbnbs and short stay accommodations, the impact that has on broader availability of housing, etc., and they're making some progress there.
Yeah, I see that. They're talking about the Deputy Lord Mayor's quoted in another article that's in the show notes about saying that short stay accommodation should pay higher rates. And that's certainly been a topic that's exercised the minds of a number of Victorian councils over the last couple of years, Chris. Interestingly, the Mornington Peninsula Shire went down the path of local law review and requiring providers of short stay accommodation to register. And I guess I will be really interested to see how that goes because, and I don't know how to describe this, my bureaucratic concern with the rates, Chris, is where does it start and stop? What are the thresholds under which rates would be payable? Some people use those short stay sites only for a few weeks a year when they happen to be going away or at peak holiday season. Other people are running a business full time. How do you ensure there's some equity in that?
So, Steve, that story was prior to a notice of motion that had been moved by the Deputy Mayor or flagged by the Deputy Mayor for the Hobart Council meeting last week. I can report that it was passed. An urgent report will be prepared to provide the Council with advice on how or if it can apply variable differential rates for those types of properties and also vacant land that's zoned as residential is going to be picked up in that review as well. So we'll watch that one with interest.
I think we will, Chris. There's a couple of things that fall out of that for me. And one is that notion of rates on vacant land as being an incentive to develop that land as soon as possible is, I guess a well-known dynamic. The other thing is we've now got another reason to talk with Kelly Grigsby.
Ah, yes, good point. Yes, because unfortunately we weren't able to connect with Kelly due to circumstances beyond our control a couple of weeks ago. So you can see why we didn't want to just skip this week's governance update. So much news, Steve. A couple of stories out of New South Wales, which are very significant. The first involving Central Coast Council. Listeners and viewers might be aware that that council was suspended back in late 2020 over concerns around its financial health. At the time, it was reported that its debt had increased over a 4-year period to over $500 million. The councillors were suspended, administrators have been in place on an interim basis, a public inquiry has been conducted, the independent report was received and released by the local government minister this week, along with news that those councillors have all been terminated. Their office has been terminated effective immediately. Pretty serious stuff.
Yeah, damning, Chris, and you might recall that was a publicly broadcast public inquiry.
Yes.
And I know you tuned into some of it too. The things that we picked up from the article, the council was in receipt of results over a number of years that were worse than budgeted. The second part, Chris, was that it was found that the councillors had the means to review their financial circumstance but failed to do so. So it was like, you could have. But a number of councillors have been quoted as saying, we didn't know, we didn't get the reports. And what that says effectively is, well, you could have, you needed to ask. And there was also, I think, some criticism for the organisation more generally about a dynamic in the organisation or in the council whereby councillors were actively discouraged from reviewing the budget. And we've talked separately, Chris, about that tension between councillors having that strategic oversight, but also maintaining a level of interest and information about the whole budget in a way that's still functional for the organisation.
Steve, what comes to my mind is how complex and challenging the role of the councillor can be. We talk about them having to operate at the strategic level and that they've got to make informed decisions but not get too deep into the weeds. The budget's a bit of a special case. You've got to be able to ask the right questions, probe in the right places. You do need to have that level of information to be satisfied that you're fulfilling your governance responsibilities and making those informed decisions. I'm not making any comment on the Central Coast councillors, but I think I'm just making the comment that it is a challenging and complex set of circumstances for councillors to navigate.
Oh, look, it is indeed, Chris, and it is much harder to navigate where there is low trust between the council and the administration, because every program within that budget, I guess, is a deal between the elected council and the organisation on the basis of, if this amount is budgeted, what will be delivered. And, often my sort of sense of that is that most of the budget from year on year won't change greatly. I mean, your cost drivers are going to be substantially staff, contractors and a bit of materials, some IT and overheads. A lot of that doesn't change. But so for the councillors having the trust in the organisation and knowing that, as you know, Chris, for the staff to go through the budget process and the executive review that happens before you even get to council is pretty rigorous. But the council needs to have the oversight.
Absolutely. So again, link in the show notes. The Commissioner has made 8 recommendations. The Minister has said that the interim administrator has been asked to continue to assist in the ongoing recovery of that council until an election, which is widely expected to happen this year, but the date is yet to be set. But there's some interesting reading in that report, even around the council's status as a water authority in relation to how the legislation works in New South Wales, which at first reads a bit complex, but it's worth having a look at if you're interested in those.
Yeah, my recollection is there were some financial remedies available to the council that it chose not to take in that space.
Okay. All right, and still in New South Wales, the other big bit of news this week is that those elections that the Electoral Commissioner had sought to be voided by the Supreme Court have been voided this week by the Supreme Court. So we're talking about Kempsey, Singleton Shire and one ward in Shell Harbour Council. This is pretty extraordinary stuff. So those elections will have to happen again. They'll have to happen by around early July at the latest. The Commissioner has said the councils won't have to pay for those elections. And the other key thing that I want to point out here, Steve, is the Justice has been very clear in saying that the candidates in those elections are completely innocent of any of the conduct said to have caused the elections to miscarry. And that's important, Steve, because there's been so much conjecture and mudslinging going on via social media, etc., blaming those candidates for that outcome, which from where I'm sitting just seems completely unfair and erroneous. So the Justices obviously felt the need to make that point very explicitly.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, my understanding is substantially there were technological issues in the conduct of the ballot and the count.
Exactly right. So inconsistencies or irregularities, I guess we should say, with that iVote system. It hasn't covered itself in glory, has it?
No, but even so, Chris, I think in failure, it's a reminder that the transference of the conduct of elections from the council administration to an independent electoral body that is tasked with and a specialist in the conduct of elections is a rather excellent piece of public policy.
I know you're a pencil and paper fan too, should be said. Now, there's an important launch or announcement coming tomorrow that you want to give a quick mention to, Steve?
Yeah, Chris, keep an eye out. The Victorian Aboriginal and Local Government Strategy 2021 to 2026 will be launched tomorrow, I believe, by Minister Lean. My understanding is that will replace the VLGA. So a lot of councillors either have a reconciliation plan or a RAP or are working through a strategy of engagement with First Nations peoples. This is a really significant document that we've been waiting on for some time. And I could say that the standards of conduct require that councillors have an approach, and it's part of the induction to engagement or reconciliation and engagement with First Nations people. I could say that the role of the council includes having regard to federal, state and regional strategies. But I guess the other thing is just the right thing to do, Chris.
Couldn't say that any better, Steve. Thanks for that heads up, and I do hope we'll be able to spend some time on what that new strategy means for the sector on VLGA Connect in the not too distant future.
That would be a good thing to do.
I want to finish on a sad note, Steve. We reported last week that Susan Salter had resigned as a councillor at the Borough of Queenscliff to manage an ongoing illness. We did not have the sense of how serious that illness was, obviously, because sadly she's passed away just this week. Former mayor and councillor of nearly 10 years. Great loss.
Chris, absolutely. And look, I didn't know Susan, but the outpouring of grief and tributes has been quite stunning. Chris, the one that struck me, and it was stuck behind the paywall of the Geelong Advertiser, but one of Susan, as a school teacher, one of her former pupils wrote a piece which included this paragraph, and I think it'd be a nice way to finish today. Thank you for being a powerful force in our lives, an inspirational woman, Dimboola country girl turned maths whiz, tough teacher, global traveller, gardener and Queenscliff mayor, community champion. So Vale Susan Salter.
Indeed, Vale Susan Salter. Lovely words. Thank you, Steve. As always, have a good week. We'll see you again for Governance Update on Friday.
Cheers, Chris. See you then.
Steve Cooper, Chief of Staff of the VLGA. That's your Governance Update for another week, albeit just a little late. Thanks for your patience, and thanks to Hunt & Hunt Lawyers for being our ever-present wonderful sponsors of the program. And keep watching VLGA Connect for more from the world of local government. Bye for now.